Ruby Kelly, the co-president of the League of Women Voters, along with Ruth Odell, who is in charge of our communication. Welcome to the first of a four-part series entitled Democracy in Crisis. The League thank you, our special guests, members, local members, state members, national members, and non-members who we are always open for membership to. You for being a part of this very important series. I also want to thank two of our League members who have worked so diligently to coordinate these great series, Joanne Grimowich and Evelyn Smith. We have a first few guidelines we want to cover before we get started. We want to ask that all of you, when you're not speaking, to place your audio on mute. Also, we have the chat feature for you to place any questions that you may have or comments in. At the end of the presentation, from our guest speaker, the moderator will give you a chance to ask any additional questions that you may not have placed in the chat or made any comments. Right now, I want to introduce Evelyn Smith, who is our first vice president and the chair of voter services. She will be introducing our moderator, who in turn will be introducing our speaker. Again, thank you for taking your time to be a part of such an important part of us tonight. Evelyn?
Thank you, Ruby. This is our first program in a series of 4, and this program is about voter suppression. It's an honor to introduce our moderator for this evening's conversation, Mrs. Carol Andersen. Carol is a co-president of the League of Women Voters of Mississippi. There are currently 5 active local leagues in Mississippi: Oxford, Jackson, Meridian, Hattiesburg, and the Gulf Coast. Mrs. Andersen has held several local and state board positions since becoming active with the League 10 years ago. In addition to her leadership role with the League of Women Voters, Mrs. Andersen is Assistant Director of the Mississippi Humanities Council, an independent nonprofit affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which provides public programs in liberal arts disciplines such as history, literature, and philosophy. She previously worked as a program director for the Mississippi Center for Nonprofits after an early career in journalism. She moved to Jackson from Iowa in 2001 with her husband, Anthony Mawson, a professor of public health at Jackson State University. The couple has 2 teenage daughters. Mrs. Andersen, we are excited about you being here to moderate our conversation about voter suppression. And we are excited because not only will you moderate it, but you're going to introduce our speaker. And so now I will turn it over to Mrs. Andersen, Carol Andersen.
Thank you, Evelyn, very much. Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm the co-president of the State League of Women Voters, along with my co-president, Christy Wheeler, who is involved with our Gulf Coast League. I am very happy to serve as the moderator for tonight's conversation with Emmanuel Williams, who is the founder and CEO of the EDW Group. The EDW Group is a Jackson-based government affairs and business advisory firm with a diverse set of relationships from the State House to the U.S. Capitol. The EDW Group focuses on securing resources for state and local governments, nonprofits, businesses, and individuals. They provide strategy for political candidates, legislators, community leaders, and business owners while garnering resources for client interests. And they advise clients who have community interests on how to gain political support and navigate effectively in a changing political climate. Emmanuel's personal history has included working with U.S. Congressman Benny G. Thompson on every level, from the district office in Greenville to the congressional office in Washington, D.C., and the House Homeland Security Committee. He currently represents the Mississippi Delta Medical Marijuana Association and lobbied against and defeated the legislation that would make the medical marijuana industry very expensive for small businesses in Mississippi. As a legislative and advocacy director at the ACLU of Mississippi, he oversaw the day-to-day lobbying, advocacy, and policy of that organization. And as a federal advocacy manager with the HBCU Collective, he lobbied for funding for historically Black colleges and universities. He is a proud alumnus of the historic Tougaloo College with a bachelor's degree in English, and he also holds a Master of Professional Studies in Political Management from the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. I will tell you there is a great deal more to Emmanuel's resume, but I really want to turn the microphone over to him now so he could share with you in his own words his work and his concerns about the current threats to our democracy in the United States. Emmanuel?
Good evening to all of you. First of all, whose ever bio that is, it isn't me. That sounds way too good to be true. On a serious note, thank you all for having me. Thank you all for the call and the invitation. I took this very seriously, which is why I'm going to rely solely on my speech that I've prepared, my remarks that I've prepared. I'm going to try not to be like our former president and go off script and try to keep it facts only tonight. And so I have been looking forward to this. I look forward to the conversation at hand. And so I'll begin with a quote. "Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves. And the only way they could do this is by not voting." Franklin Roosevelt. "Nobody's free until everybody's free." The late, great Fannie Lou Hamer, our fellow Mississippian. I could easily begin with a quote by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The son of a Baptist minister and a deacon in my own right, I began preparing tonight's remarks and for this conversation by asking God to speak to me. Though I had some ideas as to the direction I would go, nevertheless, help and research have never hurt anybody. So if I were giving a sermon today, I would start with what any Baptist clergyman and great orator would do, which is to give the historicity or historical context of the text or issue at hand. Looking back at the past is always a great way to understand where we are, where we're going, and how to arrive at a sensible destination. Well, you might ask, what is that destination? The destination is the realization of the dream that Dr. King had, a place where all men and women can live together in harmony with equality and equity, the ideals of a democracy or even a republic where the idea of voting could otherwise not even exist. The very thought, the nature, the free will involved in the process screams democracy. So we should begin with a timeline to understand democracy, voting in our country, the suppression of the vote, and the solutions to keep the vote, thereby making our martyrs of justice, equality, and democracy forever memorialized in not only our hearts, but in our system of government. You see, when we think about the concept of democracy, when we think about America, we have to go back to Athens, Greece. That's where we get our idea of democracy from. The ancient Grecians used a form of democracy that was called direct democracy. They used everyday Greek folks to directly make the decisions that affect their everyday ways of life. We have what is similar to that, but a little bit different, and what we call a representative democracy or republic. And that we choose the folks we want to make the important decisions in terms of governance. And so as we move on and we think about America and the idea of a free country, fast forward a couple of centuries until the 1600s, when you have the new colonies coming together to declare great independence from Great Britain. This idea of religious freedom, this idea of not having a voice, but also being taxed. And so it is in 1776 when this idea of the United States of America comes into place. They were once called the United Colonies, but between Thomas Jefferson writing it down, Benjamin Franklin using the name, and a use of war supplies being initialed as USA, we now have what is now called the United States of America, but not colonies anymore. We've declared our own independence from Great Britain. All of this is tied into the conversation about not only democracy, but about voting in our country. It's interesting that at the time that we're talking about a land where they're free and the home of the brave, and this idea that all men are created equal, yet the right to vote was largely left only to white male property owners. Since America's founding days, when voting was limited to only white male property owners, the transformative voting rights of 1965, the sweeping voting process reform introduced in the early 2000s, the right to vote in the US elections law has seen massive change. In the 1820s, property qualifications began to be eliminated, and amendments, including the 15th and 19th Amendment, granted the right to vote to Black men and to women respectively. Although they didn't guarantee that right to vote, as you would assume, during the nearly century-long Jim Crow era, for example, intimidation, violence, literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clause, and all other sorts of divisive tools were used to keep folks from voting. The Voting Rights Act did what Reconstruction did. It put federal muscle behind the voting rights. And so I'll begin with a few specific timelines, starting with 1776. In 1776, you have the Declaration of Independence, which frames this idea of voters' rights. Thomas Jefferson writes, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." June 21st, 1788, voting is left to the states. The US Constitution is adopted on this date, but in lieu of a federal government, it grants states the power to establish standards for voting rights. As a result, mostly white, Anglo-Saxon European males who own property who are older than 21 are the only group allowed to vote. July 9th, 1868, following the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery, the 14th Amendment is ratified, thereby granting citizenship to all people, born or naturalized in the United States, and equal protection under the laws. February 3rd, 1870, Black men are now granted the right to vote. The 15th Amendment is ratified, granting Black men the right to vote, and this gives Congress the power to enforce the right. However, of course, you would know that poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather classes are all enacted in mostly Southern states, suppressing this right from African Americans up until 1965. August 18th, 1920, women finally get the right to vote. A little organization by the name of the League of the Women was heavily involved in this movement, the women's suffrage movement, granting American women the right to vote. The right of citizens of the United States to vote should not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on an account of sex. Congress now has the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. June 2nd, 1924. Now you're seeing the starting of Native Americans being allowed to vote. with Congress enacting the Indian Citizenship Act, granting the right to vote to Native Americans born in the United States. Despite its passage, of course, some states continued to bar Native Americans from voting. March 20th, 1961, Washington, D.C. residents can vote in presidential elections, finally. The 23rd Amendment is ratified, allowing American citizens living in the District of Columbia to vote for president and vice president. Prior to its passage, D.C. residents could only vote for those offices with valid registration and in one of the nation's states. January 23rd, 1964, poll taxes are finally banned. The 24th Amendment is ratified, prohibiting the use of poll taxes in federal elections. And then finally in 1965, and I could go on and on because I'm a political nerd about this particular point, you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If you can imagine any of our most recent controversial legislative debates on the federal level, whether it be expanding healthcare, whether it be the Black Lives Matter movement, or any other controversial movement, take yourself back to 1965 and imagine all types of filibusters and legislative maneuvers to prevent the right to vote for African Americans and everyone in this country. But finally, the act is passed after all type of legislative maneuvers. Finally, in 1971, folks who are 18 and older can vote, largely because of the Vietnam War that was going on. You had all these young soldiers who were going to fight a war, but they weren't allowed to vote. 1975, you have some rights for non-English speakers being enacted. 82, the Voting Rights Act was extended by President Reagan. 84, voting is made more accessible to the disabled. 1993, voter registration is enacted through the DMVs. So now when you go to get your driver's license or your state ID, you can fill out a paper that registers you to vote. And so it's putting more access at the hands of everyday voters. October 29th, 2002, the Help America Vote Act, enacting sweeping voting process reform, President Bush passes this law and mandates Election Assistance Commission to approve and certify voting equipment in the National Voter Registration Form. 2013, you have this very, very controversial court case with Shelby County versus Holder, where now the Voting Rights Act is kind of walked back. And so, you know, starting in the early 1800s, you have this conversation up until about 2013, this conversation where voting rights is expanded. After about 2013 and up until 2020, and where we are now today in 2021, it seems like this idea of suppressing the vote begins to be enacted. The Brennan Center in 2021 put together a voting laws roundup where they gathered some information, and that data said that 19 states had passed laws that made it harder for most folks to vote. But out of that same data, 25 states passed laws that made it easier to vote, or really made voting by mail easier. And so I could go on and on with specifics about where we are between, you know, all mail voting and no excuse absentee voting between 2000.
You're muted, Emmanuel.
You go from 22 to 43 states. Then all of a sudden between 2000 and between 2020, you have this conversation about voter identification, which we'll get to later, and sort of a soapbox of mine. You go from 13 states to 34 states, all requiring some form of ID. And so even same-day voter registration, kind of a good thing, 6 states allowing it and 21 states allowing it. In 2000, you had no states that were allowing online voter registration. Now in 2020, you have about 40 states offering it. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, we talk about voting rights. I'm hopefully prepared to bring this to a close. We talk about the importance of voting rights and suppressing their right to vote. You know, there was a conversation being had about how you know it's such a precious right, it's such a precious privilege. If it wasn't so precious, one, there would be no one trying to suppress that right. Two, folks wouldn't be trying to draw funny maps to keep all the power. And so you have this article that comes out in The Intercept that largely points to one political party who puts together a whole strategy on creating their own sort of maps in states, a countrywide campaign centered on gerrymandering, essentially. I won't spend too much time on that because I'm an independent and we're a nonpartisan organization. But that goes into another conversation. Gerrymandering, redistricting, suppressing the right to vote affects all Americans. But by and large, it certainly affects people of color and poor people. The Brennan Center for Justice put together some information that says using country-level turnout data around the country, research has demonstrated that the racial turnout gap grew when states enacted strict voter registration laws. Researchers have also looked specifically at the turnout of individuals in places like North Carolina without proper identification and found that the enactment of the law reduced voter turnout. The turnout effects continued even after the strict voter ID law was repealed. Another study shows that voters in Texas who will be barred from voting absent the state's reasonable impediments declaration, a court-ordered remedy allowing voters without proper IDs to participate, are disproportionately Black and Latino. The study argues that its findings indicate that stricter identification laws will stop a disproportionately amount of minority voters otherwise from being registered to vote and thus voting. Voters of color consistently face longer waiting lines on election day, lines that are exacerbated by removing alternative options, such as vote by mail or expansive early voting hours. A report from 2020 indicates that voters of color around the country reported longer wait times far back and as recent as 2018, using self-reported wait times from a national survey. And so that brings us to the next conversation. If there's so much voter suppression, if there is this conversation about the expansion or the lack thereof of the expansion of voting rights, we have this conversation that we can't avoid, and it's the idea of voter fraud. And all of the information that I've found through my research, through my time in politics, voter fraud makes up less than 1%. Less than 1%. I'm not saying it's an issue that deserves to be addressed. I'm not saying that it's not an issue at all, but it's just a smokescreen. And so it brings me to the next question. In Mississippi, we have a long way to go. Currently, we only have the absentee ballot process that's allowed for various different reasons. I think there needs to be some innovation there. And an affidavit ballot, thereby called provisional voting if you don't have an ID. We certainly have a long way to go. Well, one might ask, what then is the purpose of voting with all the attempts to suppress the right to vote? The politicalization of this right, make no mistake, When you go in that voting booth and vote, that's political. As you know, we have a representative democracy. Thus, we choose who represents us and the issues that are significant to us. Voting is how we take part in that process and create the world that we want to live in. As political battles continue around the nation over voting access and restrictions, a new Pew Research Center survey finds that a majority of Americans, 57%, said voting is a fundamental right for every adult citizen and should not be restricted in any way. Where do we go from here? Is it all doom and gloom? Is that the end? Do we give up? No. We play the game. We get ourselves registered to vote. We get as many folks registered as we can. We join organizations like the League, where there's a collective of like-minded people. We encourage others to join. We write op-eds and we talk about the issues that are affecting us. We directly lobby ourselves. We create partnerships and make allies with the diverse partners. We engage in grassroots lobbying, getting the people closest to people that are important to the decision makers to influence them as well. And we support candidates that support the issues that are important to us: education, Medicaid expansion, these types of things. And on our own, we use the power of voting. The power of fundraising is directly tied to your First Amendment right. We play the game, we get in, and we go all in. This, I think, is a worthy fight to take on, but it's a fight worth taking. And I'm glad to be a part of an organization doing the great work to make sure that the fight keeps on.
Emmanuel.
Hopefully I didn't go over 20 minutes.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. Sorry, I've been keeping an eye on the questions in the chat, and I'm going to just take them one right after the other so that I don't accidentally miss one if I try to go out of order. So some of these may have been better grouped, but I'm just going to go at them one by one. So the first question in the chat is, could you speak about how other democracies make voter registration and voting easier?
I mean, if we're going to look at, and this is only in reference to, I could answer that kind of twofold, and I'd like to get some more information about that specifically. But one way is if you look at ancient Greece, what they kind of did was citizens took turns being the elected officials. And if you didn't participate, you were kind of like shunned and kind of fined. I think what we need to do is we need to see more everyday people involved in the process, whether that's running for office or being a part of the election of more people, supporting the right folks. You know, good old, in the political world, it's always good to be behind a candidate and know who's coming next, than just kind of supporting whoever comes up. And those are the types of ways. If there are folks in your local community that are in the state that run on the issues that are important to you, you get behind those issues. You get behind those issues.
Okay.
What happened there? You get behind those issues. That's the first thing. Secondly, you look at other states. Other states allow more innovative ways to voting than we do, such as early voting, more early voting, more absentee voting. What I would like to see in our state is more forms of early voting, perhaps. If we aren't going to make Election Day and a holiday, what I think you should do is open the courthouse up on more Saturdays than we currently have, and maybe even do some type of form of online voter registration. So I know that was a long explanation, but yeah.
Okay. I am going to take these next two out of order because there are just three questions so far, and I do invite everyone else out there who might have a question to go ahead and put it in the chat and I will get to it. I'm going to take these two out of order. Do we have states that conduct all of their elections by mail? And can you talk about that process?
I don't know. I'd have to double check, but I don't know any state that does everything by mail. That's the simplest answer to that. I don't know any state that does everything by mail.
Let's say theoretically there was a state that did everything by mail. What would be the reasons that wouldn't work?
I mean, and then it goes back to kind of the conversation of would the mail make it on time? You'd have arguments about when folks sent in their ballot. Of course, you'd have folks arguing the whole voter fraud issue. You know, the one thing about voting in person on the large scale that we do it is I can look at you and you can look at me. I can verify that this is John Smith voting. I don't know what he's voting for, but I know he's voting. You lose the power to do that when you expand absentee voting to that degree, so to speak.
One of our participants, I believe it's Deirdre Payne, has located an online link that shows there are 18 states with all mail election, by mail election.
It'd be interesting to see what that would look like in Mississippi.
Yep. Okay, let me go back up. We have a question. Emmanuel, I assume you've been closely monitoring the legislature in Jackson. Are they going to pass any new election law amendments? If they haven't already, what will make it even more difficult? That will make it even more difficult to vote.
So we were monitoring HB 1510, which is Secretary of State's bill that was garnered looking at kind of auditing elections and basically requiring proof of citizenship. That bill has largely been stripped of all of the bad auditing pieces that we were concerned about. Now it still does contain some verification pieces about citizenship. And I've talked to some of the folks about these bills. I'm not super concerned about them, but what I would like to see more of is some bills that are not necessarily aimed at kind of verifying the results. Because if there was a Clarion Ledger article that came out after the 2020 election that said that for the most part, elections in Mississippi went by pretty smoothly. And so at least for, in our state, I don't think that's a conversation we should be having. I think the conversation we should be having is about what we're talking about tonight, encouraging and getting more people to vote.
So you've touched on a number of historical barriers and efforts to suppress the vote, but and you may be repeating yourself with this question, but can you talk about some specific barriers today? What in Mississippi, what are some things that keep us from voting or voting easily in our state right now?
Okay. I'll give you an example. Just the idea of voter ID, just kind of in general. Not only in our state, but any other state. I'm a young male.
Why is that a barrier? Describe why that's a barrier.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And so, for example, for me, I'm an educated man. I have access to power, have a whole lot of privilege. So getting a driver's license isn't an issue. That becomes another conversation for two specific vulnerable communities. The elderly and the impoverished. $26, $24 might not seem like a lot of money to somebody who makes a good living. But to some folks, that's whether or not I eat. And then even as it pertains to folks who are older, I know specifically older African Americans. I mean, my dad is as young as 64. He does have a driver's license, but for example, his birth certificate, his name is Calvin Williams, but on his birth certificate, the midwife at that time spelt it as Carvin Williams. And so those are the types of discrepancies in terms of verification of identity, social security number, just in terms of identifying. Everybody didn't have access to the forms needed to verify who they are, let alone the access or the funds to get what it takes. And then another thing, transportation to the polls. You know, we've counted for nothing the idea of driving to the polls. Well, what if I don't have a car? You know, what if the nearest polling place is 5 or 10 miles and I don't have access to it? These are the types of things that we have to be thinking about, even in our state. And, you know, someone might say, well, that person can vote absentee. Well, it's not always that simple. Because once again, it kind of goes back to even, you know, with an affidavit and with absentee balloting, you've got to get those ballots. And I voted when I lived in DC. I voted absentee ballot. The means to get that ballot notarized. If that's not notarized in the right place, if it's not signed in the right place, that vote in some places isn't going to count. And so, you know, it's not as simplistic as some folks would have you to think. And I think the most important thing for me is that voter fraud isn't an issue that some folks would have us to believe that it is.
Emmanuel, can you comment on lessons learned on voting during the pandemic?
I think the two lessons that I have learned is we should definitely expand absentee voting, one. But at the same time, voting is a right that the people want and that they will take advantage of. But, you know, God forbid if we go through another national pandemic, does that mean we don't go to the polls? Does that mean we don't vote? I think we do need to have some conversations in our state and just kind of in our country about how to expand mail-in voting, how to expand absentee voting, and how to come up with accessible ways for people to verify who they are and that their vote is their vote.
Can you speak to some of the particular barriers for new citizens and college students who are not living in their home states? This is related to absentee voting with the college students, but can you speak to the impact of some of our existing policies on those populations?
In terms of new citizens, it's just, yeah, I could go on and on about that. But in terms of new citizens, it's the same as the older African-American issue. It's making all the documents match up, having the understanding of where to get those documents verified, how to get them verified, the right places to go through. I really think that in our civics classes, that in terms of first-time voters, whether that's young people or older people who are just getting registered to vote, I think that there should be a civics class that practices and shows people how to get registered to vote. Okay, you need to go to the circuit clerk. I mean, I knew that because my dad was a registered voter and I worked at the Chancery clerk. But what about somebody who's not as heavily politically involved? I think there should be a class on knowing, okay, you can go to the circuit clerk, you can go to DMV, you can get registered to vote. Turn in your card at 18. I think there need to be more organizations like us, and we're doing that work, who at 17 and 18, we're at the high schools getting young folks registered to vote, thereby providing that access to people. And so just in terms of barriers, when you look at new citizens, it's just the bureaucracy that's involved in the whole process. You know, you got to go to the courthouse. If I'm a new citizen, I might not know that. And if I'm going to the courthouse, and most of our smaller places, The circuit clerk and the chancery clerk's office are in the same place. Well, what if those places are in two different parts of the world in our city? And so then it's transportation and access to public transportation. And so, it's not a tomato type of situation. It's certainly complex.
Can you speak about or speak to the motivation or justification for those who would keep certain barriers in place? We've talked about fear of voter fraud, probably unfounded fear, but what would you say are the motivations or justifications for keeping what seem to be obvious barriers in place?
Power. I don't think the folks who are saying you need to have a voter ID, I think that some folks are in the hearts. Even I, for a while, said, well, okay, what's the issue with having a voter ID? I don't think that some of these folks are saying, hey, I want to keep certain folks from voting. Now, I think there's a great majority of the folks who are involved in voter suppression tactics that are saying, hey, I want to see less women vote. I want to see less minorities vote. I want to see less elderly vote. I think there's a great group of people doing that. And then there's the other half who would consider themselves good people, who just see it as playing politics, who see it as a way to keep their party in control or to get their party to have control, and to ultimately be, Mitch McConnell says it's best. Elections have consequences. And I think that there's certain folks who want to, in their own way, control who wins elections so they can control the consequences.
Emmanuel, can you speak about the impact of the 2020 election on voting and voter turnout? Did it set us back or did it galvanize us to correct issues?
I think in terms of voter turnout, I think several things. You kind of have a dichotomy of things that's kind of set up. One, you have record turnout that's never before been seen in the history of our country. Secondly, you have, and this is during an international pandemic, but at the same time, you have people spouting voter fraud, which was proven over and over again that it was untrue. I think when put to the test, Americans will push through the mud and the manure, and they will take advantage of their right to vote. But I think that we should be making it more accessible for folks to vote. If we have all these election holidays and all these holidays, why isn't voting a holiday? Now, at the risk of sounding like a screaming liberal, I won't harp on that too much because I'm an independent. But seriously, that's just something to think about. I'm not saying there's a one size fits all answer for all of this, but I think that most Americans agree on innovation and things that would make our lives easier. Okay. Well, if you're going to have voter ID laws, well, let's have laws and systems put in place that make it easier for the least of those to get all of the identification that they need. And in terms of organizations like ours, if they're going to suppress our rights to vote, let's beef up our voter registration drives. Let's be getting folks registered to vote 365 days a year. Every time a young woman turns 18, she should be hearing about the League of Women Voters and other great organizations like ours. And we should be in their faces. A lot of times people give people in government affairs or lobbyists are a bad reputation or a bad rap. But of all the good people in the world, all the middle class folks and all the poor folks put $1 together, you could hire folks like me and do even more power than the 1%. And so it's about using the things that are at our disposal. It's the same game that's been played for ages, for centuries. It's figuring out what part we want to play in it and how we take control to win for what is good and what is right. And what's right is every American citizen who's a good, upstanding citizen having the right to vote, whether they're young, whether they're old, whether they're Black or white, rich or poor. That's the only way to have a balanced society. That's the only way to be in a society and in a country that's gonna, I'm not talking about socialism here. I'm just talking about a decent society that considers everybody. And the only way to do that is by giving everybody access to the ballot.
We have two great questions in the chat. I'm going to take them out of order just because I think the one flows well after what you've just said. How can we help people, quote unquote, play the game?
One, it starts with getting more folks registered to vote. It starts with writing op-eds, talking about the issues. All the stuff that I'm telling you to do are political measures that professionals like me use. We write op-eds. We give folks in organizations like ours to write op-eds about the issues. We pile together money to support candidates. We put together protests. We put together hearings. We put together town halls. There are a number of different ways in which to do that. And I hope to be exercising and teaching a lot of those ways while I'm the legislative liaison. And so it starts with getting more folks registered to vote, being active in your local league, and being active in local politics. Your local folks should know who you are. Our state folks should know who we are. And of course, the national folks should know our national organization. And so the more you're involved, the more you vote and the more people you get registered to vote, the more we get a chance to take control of the game.
Great question up now. What advice would you give younger and or less politically educated people who are passionate about voter oppression? Where and how should we apply our energy and our focus?
I don't know at what point personally I decided that I wanted to be in politics, but it came out of a desire to see better. And I wanted to be the next congressman from Greenville, Mississippi at that time. And then I found out lobbyists make more and don't have to be on any political side. And I said, hey, I want to be a lobbyist. And so personally, I am, one, trying to train more of our members how to advocate when I'm not around. Two, I'm trying to educate as many young folks as I can and help produce more lobbyists. I think it starts with simple things. As I look back as a kid growing up, my dad always watched the news, The little things like that plant seeds. And I find myself with the news on, even if I'm not listening to it. It started with watching 60 Minutes, understanding what was going on around me. And then I started little by little finding subjects that appealed to me and trying my best to understand where we were and where we are. And so it's as simple as watching the news and getting involved in maybe a youth organization like ours, and just staying involved. I got started as a Senate page in the Mississippi State Capitol, which led to doing some rallies for some folks, which led to an internship, which led to some other internships and some jobs. And now I have my own firm, and now I'm working with the league. And so it starts that simple. You just got to find something you're passionate about, find an issue or an organization you like that's doing good work, and get involved. I mean, I think I was kind of destined. I was in student government from first grade all the way up to graduating college. So there you go. And those organizations, by the way, helped me understand parliamentary procedure, things that are important to understand, even, that local city councils and mayors use in terms of how they conduct meetings. Figuring out one small way to get involved and just taking it all the way through is the best way.
In addition to the League of Women Voters, and I think you've mentioned a few tonight, but what are some other organizations that are doing good work, effective work in our state to defeat voter suppression? What are some other like-minded organizations that you are impressed by?
I will mention organizations. I'll tweak that a little bit. Who I think have good intentions, but their strategy should probably be a little bit different. Groups like the ACLU of Mississippi, who I used to work with and for. Mississippi Votes does a great job of engaging young people. The Parents Campaign, Mississippi Association of Educators. I could go on and on. My goal as the liaison for the league is to work with some of these partner organizations and even some of the other conservative organizations where we can, because that's how you create influence and you develop a footprint. And so it's figuring out where you can create partnerships with similar organizations, but also organizations that are closer to the folks in power. If you know that, for example, we're probably not going to agree with Empower on education issues because they're pro-charter schools, but we're pro-funding public education. Well, what other issue can we work together on that will get us some attention in a good way from our Republican-held leadership? And working with other organizations where there is some similarity to kind of create some synergy, so to speak. And that's personally how I've developed a reputation on both sides of the aisle as just being a professional. And that's one of the ways to do it. And most of all, keeping to the facts. Politics is emotional, but remembering that it's a sport, remembering that it's tact to doing it, we can always get somewhere.
We have just a few minutes left. I do have another question, but I'm going to put an invitation out for anybody who has any questions of their own to go ahead and put them in the chat. I am keeping an eye on that. So we've got a few minutes. So if you want to frame your last question or two, that would be great. Emmanuel, again, I'm asking you to repeat yourself, I realize, but talk a bit more about what we as individual citizens who want to remove barriers, educate folks on the voting process, how to understand what they're voting for. What are things that individuals can be doing?
For example, if you're not a professional lobbyist like me, what I would suggest is picking an issue, one issue, not two or three, but one issue. Watch all the documentaries on it you can. Read all of the news on it you can. Then start talking to people in your community who might know something about it that you don't. Ask them their thoughts on it. Think about what your solutions would be to that particular problem. And then start drafting or putting together a strategy to solve that problem in your state or your community. For example, if everybody has a flooding problem in your community, it's probably important to find out, okay, is this a city problem? Is this a fault line problem? Well, you find out, okay, do I need to talk to MDEQ? Who's the government authorities I should probably have a conversation with? That's the first part. Well, who else is probably going to agree with me? Who's going to disagree with me? And where can we come up with a compromise that's going to work for everybody? That's generally how I approach everything, whatever that is. And so, whatever those issues are, aligning yourself or joining an organization that fights on behalf of those issues and taking ownership in those organizations, I'm going to be responsible for putting together the speaker. Even things like tonight, where we're having these conversations. Somebody was responsible for putting this together. Things like that matter. Whether it's saying, hey, I'm going to be responsible for bringing in the young people that we're working with. We're going to offer community service to these students for registering to vote or being at this event. There are different things that you can do. It just kind of depends on the person, and kind of case by case situation. But it starts with identifying the issues that are important to you, doing the research. And when I say do the research, I don't mean you have to be an expert. I learn pretty differently. I learn by immersing myself in the topic specifically and by watching documentaries. For different folks, it might be different. Whatever way that you know to get involved, that's what you do. Whether it's going to a local city council meeting, a local supervisors meeting, and getting to know all the players that are involved in that issue.
Sounds to me like boiled down, Emmanuel, that is do something. Don't do nothing. Do something.
Absolutely.
Okay, it is just about the end of our hour together. Any other questions from the folks in the room at all? And if not, Emmanuel, do you want to leave us with a few parting thoughts before our host comes back on?
I'll just say this. Yet again, I don't know whose poor choice it was to ask me to speak tonight, but I've enjoyed it. I thank you for making that horrible decision. On a serious note, everyday people can make such a huge change if we band together. There are a lot of areas where most of us agree, and figuring out where we agree on what issues we agree on and figuring out a place to work together. We're not going to always agree on how to get there, but if we can agree on the destination that we want to be at, we can figure out how to get there slowly but surely. Keep fighting and never stop fighting. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I'm not sure that I mentioned this in my introductory remarks, but for those of you who don't know, Emmanuel is currently the legislative liaison for the state board of the League of Women Voters. So he's gotten to know really intimately what matters to the League and has helped teach us a few tricks about how to communicate what we hope to see happen. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Carol. I'd also like to thank Emmanuel for giving us your time. I know how important time is these days. Thank you. And before we say goodnight, I just want to remind you about the rest of this community conversation that we are going to have next week on March 9th. The subject is going to be gerrymandering, a very timely topic, and we are fortunate to have Barbara Phillips as our speaker and Don Mason as our moderator. Then we take a break in the middle of March, spring break, and then the next week is March 23rd, attacks on elected officials, and our speaker for that topic is going to be Mississippi Secretary of State Michael Watson, and I will be your moderator. And then our last subject, but definitely not the least, is on March 30th. And the topic is manipulating the Electoral College, something we saw in the last election, or a lot of attempts in the last election. And our speaker for that topic is going to be Adam Ambrogi, the Senior Director for Voting and Elections of the League of Women Voters of the United States, the national level. And our moderator will be Dr. Ruth Odell, our co-president of our local League of Women Voters. So thank you for very much for coming out and spending time with us. I hope you had something you can take away with you, and we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday when the subject is gerrymandering.